Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our house. Our house doesn't normally look like this with all these books around here, but we've been invited by Premier and by Simon & Schuster Atria, who is the publisher for the new book that comes out tomorrow, Lies We Believe About God. And neither I or, let's see, it's what the proper English. Yeah, neither I nor my daughter Amy have ever done this. So we're just kind of winging it. We know that a bunch of you have sent questions in, and you are free to do that. You're also free, I don't even know how to do this, but I know how to tell you about it. You can hit share somewhere on this, and it'll go to your friends.
This shows its age.
Yeah, it does. And so this is Amy. She's one of our 6 kids. She's number 4 in the sequence, and she's going to act as the moderator. I'm going to sign some books. By the way, when I sign them, I'm signing this little, it's called a book plate. And when you get your copy, for those of you who've ordered one, that's what it's going to be on, a little book plate. They kind of look like this, and then they're peel and sticks. But I'll sign them, and we'll get them out to you. A couple other things. This also just came out, which is the audio version, and I got to read it, which was very fun.
I didn't know that you read this one.
Yeah, I did. It's a nonfiction. I'm not going to try to tackle a fiction book because you sort of need an actor who can be consistent with all the voices and things. And but a nonfiction, I can do that. And I think we got Baxter Kruger, who wrote the foreword, to actually in the audiobook do the foreword in his own voice, which is great.
Nice.
And he's a Mississippi boy, so that's good.
So what prompted you to write Lies We Believe About God?
Well, I'm so glad you asked.
Oh, good.
This actually began as an extension for tweets that I was doing on Twitter, which I actually know how to do that. And so I had a series of them that I was looking at negative space. Like instead of the positive space, sometimes if you're drawn to negative space in art, you can see things that you wouldn't otherwise see. So inside of my history, which is Christianity, we have a lot of positive space. This is this, this is this, this is this. So I did a series of tweets on words you would never hear God say.
For example?
Like, I'm disappointed in you. Or like, I'm sorry you died, there's nothing I can do for you, death wins. Mm-hmm. Which
are powerful.
Yeah, I mean, when you start looking at things that God wouldn't say, suddenly what he does say makes a lot more sense. Well, that turned into a conversation about how could we turn those into something that would be actually helpful. And one of the things in my history that has been really helpful, that wasn't really allowed when I was younger, because I grew up in a quite rigid, modern evangelical fundamentalism, and that was the presence of questions. When I asked questions when I was growing up, I would get things like, rebellion is worse than witchcraft. and it's like, you're not allowed to ask questions? How are you supposed to learn anything? But I think there was a sense that a lot of folks were dependent on the certainty of the doctrine, and they just wanted to stay there. Well, questions have become my friends. In the novel Eve, I have one of my favorite lines, and it's Eve's talking to a character named John and says, choose your question well. One good question is worth 1,000 answers. And it's because there's different ways to look at a question. And once we get into that kind of a conversation, I think it's helpful. So we're going to take a look at your questions. Amy's going to help me. She's going to ask me those questions, and I'm going to sign some books as we go along. And we'll just see how it goes.
It's going to be brilliant.
That's brilliant. Yeah.
So there are so many good questions that you guys sent in. But the first one that I am going to read is from Gina in Birmingham, Alabama. And she asks, how do we protect our hearts and minds from hatred and judgment for those who openly declare they want to kill us because we are infidels and not only deserve to be killed, but need to be killed?
Wow. So
I know I just gave it to you at the beginning.
Thank you. Yeah, let's start with an easy one. That's a question that I am going to assume is about Muslims. And okay, so let's unpack it a little bit. One of the things that we do, and actually it's a really centerpiece in this book, is that we have this, because of our fear and because of our not having experiences outside the box of what's normal to us, is that we tend to categorize and box people up and say, these people are like this. Well, I have good friends who are Muslim, and they're not thinking about us being infidels, and they have no intention of killing anybody. There is a lot about the community of humanity where people have been raised in very diverse kinds of religions, but they don't deserve to be put into a box and then dealt with as just a faceless, nameless group of people. I have a friend of mine whose name is Jim Henderson. He's in Seattle. And in fact, I was talking to him today. He just saw The Shack today, the movie. And Jim said to me a long time ago, he said, relationship breaks the rules. And a lot of times our fear is based on anonymity of either them or us. And I think that's one of the reasons that the internet can be incredibly destructive. I think it can be incredibly positive and powerful. But anonymity not only gives the voiceless a voice, but it allows some of us to hide behind that anonymity and be very cruel and destructive in terms of our communications. So let's get rid of the boxes. But that means, maybe it's time to build a relationship with a Muslim and see. Maybe it's time to get outside of the box that seems normal to us. Maybe it's time to talk about the fears that we have, which you're doing, by the way, and that's an incredibly brave question, especially right now. But we're at a place in our culture and in our history, in this country and in the world, where divisions are becoming so obvious that we're going to have to make some choices about whether we're going to find ways to break those walls down or begin to annihilate one another. And I'm suggesting that there is a way forward in this conversation, but it's going to take some risk on your part. I can tell you point blank that the vast majority of Muslims have no intention of killing anybody. And if you knew the history of the Middle East, for example, you'd know that for hundreds, if not thousands of years, Muslims, Jews, and Christians have been living in great relationship with each other. It's the divisions of politics and what has been then now enforced upon that whole conversation that has driven them apart. But many of them are best of friends, continuing to be best of friends to this day. I have friends who are working in Bethlehem and with the Palestinians and the Israelis and trying to find a way to find peace. I was just at a conference recently where Muslims and Jews and Christians were all in the conversation, and they were centered around the person of Jesus. And because I think Jesus is the way forward in this conversation, for me personally, but I think for the whole human race. Because our religious stuff, it causes a whole lot of issues. And again, one of the chapters in here is that the lie is that God supports my religion. And so it fits in pretty well. So thank you for the question.
It's like replacing people with thoughts and fears.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, the rest of us do have good insight as well. So the next question comes from Marcia in Martinsville, Virginia.
Hi, Marcia.
And she asks, is it possible to truly love without being utterly broken?
Is it possible to truly love without being utterly broken? The answer is yes. And here again is the assumption. I believe in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I believe that relationship has always existed. And it's one of other-centered, self-giving love in which there was no brokenness. And it's true love. So yes, it can exist. It's hard to imagine that because we live in a world that is so broken. But I think brokenness, to work it out, opens up your capacity to love. But if you don't have the baggage, I think your capacity is much greater, quicker. It's like I brought a lot of baggage into the world and into my relationships because of things that happened to me as a child. And my children don't have the depth of that baggage. They live in a world that will give them some, and I gave them some. But I'm grateful that they don't. And because they're dealing with less, they hear quicker, they respond easier, they're ahead of where I was at their age, without a question. And I'm grateful for that. The thing about brokenness is that you have to deal with it. And at some point, you have to let people into that process because we can't do this by ourselves. And for those of us who are broken, the way forward is through it, to get to a place where we can truly love. I didn't have the capacity to love, but I'd read the books about it, and it turns out I'm smart enough to fake it, and which is pretty sad, actually. But through the journey of working on my own stuff and having people help me there, I'm much better at loving than I've ever been. And so, yeah, is it possible to truly love without brokenness? Yes, because it exists in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So that gives me hope that, this is not brokenness versus wholeness. It is, let's find our way through the brokenness to wholeness and to love better and better. Yeah. Okay.
And the next question actually comes from Portland, Oregon, from Francis. Portland. Is religion evolving or vanishing altogether?
Is religion evolving or vanishing altogether? That's a great question, and it's actually that'd be one of my favorite questions. It's vanishing. It is not evolving. It's going to vanish. And here's why. Because God has never been a religious being. I mean, think about that. God has never been a religious being. Prior to creation, there wasn't like an order of service or a place that they gathered on Saturdays or Sundays, or there was a relationship. It has always been a relationship, face to face to face. And the relationship is so profoundly intimate that you can only talk about God as being one, that there is one God. And but the reality that one God is three persons in relationship who never lose their identity. The Spirit never becomes the Father never becomes the Son, because that God is oneness without the loss of personhood. That means relationship and love has always existed, but it's not religious. What does that mean? That means that every religion on the planet is something that human beings have constructed. Every one of them. God is not a religious being. We've turned out to be the religious beings. And so what does God do? Does he come and just destroy our religions? And here's what I think history will show if we begin to look at it through these lenses. That this is a God who submits to the religions that we bring to the table, and from inside begins to dismantle them for our good, for our freedom. Because I think religions not only contain elements of beauty because we're involved and we were made in the image of God and we were a good creation before anything got broken. But religion involves great depths of darkness, things that are destructive, like desiring to kill the other or divide from the other or think that you're superior from the other. The creation of boxes that give us control and power. So I think religion is going to end up destroyed. But it's going to be through a God who submits to it. And I think Christianity is a great example of that. Because Christianity is a religion. This is about relationship with God that has opened up to us because of Jesus, right? So Christianity as a religion will not last. What does God do? What does he do to Judaism, which is the roots of Christianity? Well, he comes into a world where everybody believes in sacrificial systems. And God steps into that and says, I hate sacrifice. Read the prophets. I hate sacrifice. I don't like the blood of bulls and animals. It's not going to change anything. It doesn't cleanse anybody. But you're so committed to it as human beings that I'm going to climb in and I will become the sacrifice that will end sacrifice. And Daniel says there is one coming who will cause the sacrifice to cease, to end. And in the story of Abraham and Isaac, that's God saying, let me tell you one thing that I don't like. I don't like child sacrifice. Let's start there. I do not require child sacrifice. This is in a world where it didn't matter whether you went to South America or Egypt, Baal or Marduk or all these gods, they all wanted sacrifice. And the greatest sacrifice was a child. Sacrifice an innocent. So God says, all right, I will come as a child, an innocent one, and be your I will provide myself. And that's the story of the cross. It's not God creating some kind of a torture device, as some sort of object lesson. This is about a God who climbs into humanity's torture device and then destroys its power and transforms it into such a monument of grace that it's precious to us. It tells us that there is no depth of darkness, no religious darkness that God will not go into in order to free us from it. So my view is that religion's not going to evolve. It's going to be slowly destroyed from the inside, and it's going to be done through love and kindness and grace and forgiveness. Something that says the limitations of our religion they're not real, and they're actually destructive.
All right. So I'm going to use a little bit of my creative license because I'm asking the question. And this one comes from David in McKinney, Texas. And he's asking...
I've been to McKinney.
McKinney?
Uh-huh. I have the key to the city.
Is that the one that you have?
Yes.
Well, that's awesome.
It was great.
So from McKinney that he owns.
But it doesn't even work on the restrooms, I got to tell you.
Oh.
So, go.
Do you have to have a key?
I don't know.
Oh. So outside of the Bible itself, what Christian or non-Christian book was the most influential in your life?
Ooh, that's a hard one because books generally have been profoundly influential in my life. And it just depends on what part of the process and journey I was in. And that could be fiction books, people that would write something that would touch me beyond just my head. Something like
Prince.
Steinbeck, The Little Prince. The Little Prince is one of my favorite all-time books. But heavy theology, like Jacques Ellul, some of those books really confronted me with ideas. Some philosophers, Nietzsche is a profound thinker. Kierkegaard, who is basically depressed, but brilliant. The Inklings, of course, you have your Dorothy Sayers and what's that guy's? C.S. Lewis, yeah, and Tolkien and those guys. But Charles Williams, again, influence. A.W. Tozer in my tradition was an influence on me. So but I love science fiction, so Asimov and Heinlein and these guys too. Books have had a great and powerful influence on my life. And I think, words change us, and creative words open up space so that we can hear for ourselves. So I have a lot of books that have influenced me. That's a good question, though.
All right. I think we've got a caller. And...
Are we allowed to have callers?
We are allowed to have callers. That's what happens when they get rookies. We get to make up our own rules.
So it's on speakerphone.
And it's John from Bettsville, Ohio.
Hey,
Yes.
Hey, John.
Hello, Paul. How are you?
Yeah, you know what? Everything that matters is good.
Good. I've enjoyed your books, especially, I like The Shack. That was the first one I read. And Eve, I thought that was probably the best of the books I've read of yours. But
I think so, too.
I really was impressed with that. I guess my question was, I had wrote down, are you considering a book of Jesus?
That's you know what? I haven't thought about that. There's so many other things that I've thought about. And I've thought about elements of his life, but there's a lot of writers who have spent a lot of time working on the life of Jesus. I tell you what I am doing is that I'm rewriting some of the parables and things like that from a different perspective. For example, I have Andrew, and Andrew is one of my favorite disciples because he's the young kid, right? He's Peter's little brother who happened to be tagging along, but he's always the guy that doesn't really want to identify with the others, and he's always all on the periphery. And I've got this little story that I did where he's sitting on some steps trying to be anonymous because he's really tired, and this guy comes and sits down to him and leans in and goes like, hey, who is he? And Andrew thinks that this guy is asking him about Jesus. It's like, oh, okay. So he's like trying to ignore him. And the guy just gets closer. Who is he? And he says, you mean Jesus? He says, no, not Jesus. Who's the Good Samaritan? And that starts this whole conversation from this guy's point of view in terms of what he heard. And there's an example of something that you can do that's a little bit different than what has been done. But I haven't thought about specifically focusing on Jesus, although that's a fantastic idea, actually. So thank you.
Or even the area, the whole area they lived and traveled and everything. A lot of people don't understand that.
Let me give you two books that are probably two of the best books, and they're older ones. And it's by a gentleman named Alfred Edersheim. And one is called Sketches of Jewish Social Life, which really embeds you into what the culture is at the time of Jesus. And the other one is called The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. And it's, if I could write a book, it would be like that, and brought up to modern times. But he wrote in the 20th century, which seems so long ago, but it's the one I was born in. And but Alfred Edersheim, and I think you would find him a great help with that whole conversation. But you're right, a lot of us, we just don't have a clue. We know what we know, and it's our culture.
All right, I really appreciate those titles, and I will look for them in the library. And if I can't find them there, I'll look online.
You should be able to find them in the library. Thank you so much for the call in.
And thank you for your books.
You're very, very welcome. Appreciate it. Bye-bye now.
All right. Goodbye.
Fun. That was awesome.
You can bring all the people to us.
That's great.
Mm-hmm. So the next question comes from Rick in Phoenix City, Alabama.
Uh-huh.
And he is wondering, how do you reconcile the seemingly angry God of the Old Testament with the loving God of the New Testament?
God got saved during the 400 silent years. That's a great question, and it's there's parts of that I don't know. I don't know how to reconcile it. But going back to something we were talking about earlier, and that was this whole question about the fact that God climbs into what we bring to the table, and that there are a lot of things that by the time you get to the life and times of Jesus and the authors that wrote, the disciples, they're saying things that in a sense will contradict what was written in the Old Testament. They're saying, you know what, you didn't have the whole picture. You didn't understand, which makes sense. Because when you run into Abraham, you're not talking about somebody who comes from a town where there's churches and a seminary. There's a moon god and goddess worship center in Ur of the Chaldees, and on a scale of spiritual maturity, he's probably either with a foot in A and a foot in B, but probably no further than that. But he's at least got a foot in B because he can hear voices, and enough to get out of town. And what does God do? Does God come to him in like Q or R or V and go like, hey? Because when you got a foot in A and a foot in B, B looks kind of shaky right there, right? But it's strong enough that he hears voices that he gets out of town. He takes all his little idols with him and everything else. And God is going to climb into his world. And with a foot in B and a foot in C, going like, come here, I'm going to tell you something. And one of those early things that he told him is that I don't like child sacrifice. So you've got this movement in which God accommodates to the ways that we think. And you see this tension. If you spend any time with scholars of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Scriptures, you'll find out that there is a tension within the writers themselves, that some of the editors that were involved in putting the books together are actually trying to say, yes, this is how they looked at it, but no, there's something else going on here. And then by the time you get to the New Testament, you'll have, for example, I'll give you two great examples. Paul the Apostle quotes, and there's this little rule in Scripture, in scholarship, that repetition without redundancy equals interpretation. Big words, kind of, but let me tell you what it means. Repetition without redundancy, that is that they're quoting something, but not exactly the same. Repetition without redundancy equals interpretation. So when you've got a New Testament writer who quotes the Old Testament, but not exactly, they're actually interpreting it. So Paul quotes one of the most central tenets of the Old Testament law system that Judaism, which the roots of Christianity, were built on. And he says this, he quotes this. This is what it says in the Hebrew Scripture. Cursed by God is every man who hangs upon a tree. Right? When Paul quotes it, he just says, cursed is every man. He took the by God part off. And he's saying like, yes, when you're in a frame of reference where you don't understand the big picture, you're thinking that it's God that's cursing that man. Something's bad's happening. And you know what? We still think those crazy, silly things. When something happens to somebody, what do people say? Well, it must have been God's plan. You know, when something evil occurs, when you have a loss or something. And please forgive us Christians, because sometimes we don't know how to lament, we don't know how to grieve, and we don't even know how to be present. So we say stupid things with the best of intentions. But, you know, it wasn't God that killed your child. It wasn't God that maimed the one you loved, right? That is not God. But when you have a perspective where everything's sort of magic, then your perspective's that. And Paul the Apostle is saying it's not God who curses that man. We did it. And evidence of it is that that's exactly what we did to Jesus. Isaiah talked about it 1,000 years before Jesus ever showed up, saying that we would curse him, we would spit on him, we would turn our faces away from him, and we would think that it is God, right? And that's what it says. We esteemed him stricken by God. He wasn't stricken by God, he was stricken by us. That's our torture device. We did that, right? But again, the perspective is now in Jesus. So I don't have all the answers to those. I've got a lot more than I used to. But a lot of times, we've just got to back up and look through the person of Jesus. And if what we're thinking is not consistent with Jesus, then something about the way we're looking at it is not correct. Second example from the mouth of Jesus. The disciples have been to this little town and been, now you got to understand, these guys, they're fishermen, they're tax gatherers, they're us, they're normal guys. And they've been kind of woven into this world of notoriety and platform. And so they think they're all that in a bag of chips now, right? So they go into this little town, and the town basically shuts them down. And they are perturbed about it. And sometimes when you get perturbed inside your own self, you hide behind religion in order to justify the not kind things that we do, right?
Censored.
Yeah. So they say to Jesus, and they quote the Hebrew Scriptures. Yeah, and they're going like, shouldn't we just call fire down on these people? And they're talking about Elijah, right? Because that's what Elijah did. And you'd think Jesus, because, he wants to support Elijah and the Old Testament concepts of God that were prevalent back there, you'd think he'd going like, well, that might be a good idea. You know what he says to them? You don't know what spirit you're of. And he's making a commentary on Elijah. That there's something about that we didn't have a picture of, that we were still in the process. We were maybe at C with a foot in D. And just to go back to that, when we're C, when we get to D, we think everybody in C is an idiot, right? We want to build it because we think D is the end of all ends, right? We think it's like the best thing going. And it's like, we want to be right and perfect and certain about this. E people in E, we think they're just nuts, right? So we're looking back at the people where we come from, and we begin to annihilate even the good things that tradition brought us. So I don't want to be a part of that. I want to be a part of something that actually builds the possibility of union and possibility of relationship, not more divisions. We've already proven that creating divisions doesn't help. And I think we have an opportunity to stop that. We stop it in our own lives. We stop it in our own hearts. And then we begin to let that flow out into the world around us. And yeah, we'll get used and abused in that too, but it also opens up a way not just for us, but for the people around us. So yeah, so I think that's a huge question, as you can understand, but maybe that'll help just with part of it.
Okay. So the next one is a little bit stepping in someone's sacred ground.
Okay.
So this is from Marina from Elgin, Illinois. Do you know if that's how you say it?
It is.
Okay. From Elgin, Illinois. And she says, "It is my duty as a child of God, or at some point left completely to God, to deal with and forgive people who commit horrible crimes against humans, such as murder, rape, and child abuse. I can forgive almost anything immediately, but my very close friend was murdered point blank, and 15 years later, I'm still tormented by his uncalled for and untimely death." It's cutting me off at the end, but it's pretty much saying, how do I deal with that?
So yeah. Couple things. We need to make a distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation. I think this is so important. Because when we confuse the two, we get into the top or of you let that go. And forgiveness is a process. Now, it doesn't mean you trust the person. It doesn't even mean you have to have a relationship with the person. It just means that you let go of their throat. You don't make them the centerpiece of your life, because unforgiveness will do that. And so forgiving someone is probably even more for the person who forgives than it is for the recipient of that forgiveness. Because like I say, some of those folks are too broken to care about it. Reconciliation, that's the rebuilding of trust. And that's not required, right? And there's only certain things that can rebuild trust. There's a process in which a relationship has to go through for trust to be even possible. The person who is the perpetrator has to own what they've done. Like, own it. And that means that they have to be willing to talk about it in specific terms, not in generalities. Not like, oh, I know I hurt you. No, like, I know exactly how I hurt you. This is what I did. They have to ask for forgiveness. Will you please forgive me? Not just apologize, right? Someone who can say all the right things, they seem to be contrite and all that kind of stuff, but don't change over time. Don't trust them, right? This is where boundaries come in, because those boundaries are as much for them. When we don't have boundaries, we just kind of cave in, and people are allowed to continue the evil that is destroying them and spread it even further. And that's not what this is about. And that sometimes means really hard decisions. And frankly, that's where you got to trust the Holy Spirit. That's like your conversation with God about this and about what the next step is.
And what would you say for people that do come to you and ask for your forgiveness, but you're not ready to give forgiveness? Like, is that seen as okay?
Humiliation.
But as the person that
has been hurt,
yeah. How do you deal with that? Because I know there's a lot of guilt if you don't forgive the person right away.
Okay, so that's a great question. And here's the deal. The perpetrator never has the right to expect the person they've hurt to reconcile. They never have the right to put a timetable on it, nor do they have a right to tell the person they've hurt how long it's supposed to take. if reconciliation ever happens, and I'm speaking from my own experience as the perpetrator, you understand? If reconciliation ever happens, it is an absolute gift of grace. So as the person who's been hurt, they can send you the letter, they can send you the note, they can ask for forgiveness. That doesn't mean you have to have a relationship or trust them. Not until you're ready to do it. But again, I know the sneakiness of God about these things. And I know that God climbs into the broken places like that and begins to build little bits and pieces of trust that is dependent on how that person is responding over time. And it's a miracle when it happens, but I've seen it happen. It's happened in my own life, and I know it's a possibility. A lot of times, though, our bitterness, if we don't forgive, we become bitter. And that bitterness becomes a prison to us that we will rename as a sanctuary. We will think that that's what keeps us safe because we're too afraid of the changes that would happen in our lives. Control, bitterness gives us a sense of justification and control. And I tell you, that's a hard thing. There's a scene in the shack where Mackenzie has to face with Sophia and deal with it. And there are some parts of this book that deal with this. But it's the challenge against, you're the judge, right? And you've got to let that go. And forgiveness is a part of it. But again, reconciliation, it is a process over time of rebuilding trust. Don't trust someone who is not trustworthy. You don't have to. And if they're not trustworthy, fine. But again, don't do this alone either. Yeah. None of this is designed to be done alone. We're designed to be in relationship. We're not made in the image of a God who's ever been alone. So aloneness is not something that is a part. I was visiting a man named Terry and his friend named Ron. Terry's been on death row for 33 years. Ron's been on death row for 30 years. And I got to tell you, they're two of the freest human beings I've ever been around. And we talked about that. But part of it is that they've had massive, long-term, enduring, growing relationships with Jesus. But I'm there because Terry had been so sideswiped by the shack. The scene that I just mentioned where Sophia is confronting Mackenzie about judgment. In that scene, here's what Terry said to me. He said, all these years, I haven't owned what I did by taking the precious life of someone that God loves, which is what he did. He said, all these years, I avoided owning that because I felt I was better than the pedophiles, right? That were here on death row. At least I didn't do that. And he said, I'm in that scene, I'm reading through that chapter, and he said, I'm literally crawling on the floor trying to get out of my own skin because it's such a confrontation of my heart. And he said, it broke me. He said, now I'm trying to find people who will come visit the pedophiles because some of them haven't had a visitor in decades. And I met Terry the day after that he had his final hearing. So right now, as we're talking, he's waiting to hear a date that he'll be executed. This is our world system of judgment. They think punishment's going to change something. And I understand the loss. We had a 6-month period where my 18-year-old brother was killed and my mother-in-law passed away unexpectedly and my 5-year-old niece was killed the day after her 5th birthday. So we know about loss. I know about issues of forgiveness that go back to my childhood, perpetrators, things that I didn't ask for, things that were stolen from me. I know how we get stuck. But there comes a point where I've got to let some of that go. And it's not easy and it's not immediate. And then as I become more authentic as a human being, it begins to flow out into the relationships around me. And that's our hope. Everything costs. Everything costs. To stay inside the prison of bitterness, it costs you. Right? To walk out of that prison, it will cost you too. Because it'll cost you justification for staying there, for being angry, for, you know, and it doesn't mean you don't get rid of all your anger instantly. That's a process too. And but there's got to be a way forward for us. There's got to be a way toward healing. And I'm talking to Terry and Ron. Terry says, you know what Ron and I dream about, think about, you know, besides all the stuff about Jesus and the healing in our hearts. He says, I think about what it must be like to step on grass. Right? He said, all we've stepped on for 30 years is concrete and gravel and tile. He says, what it must be like to step on something that just gives back, you know? And Ron says, you know, one night we were left outside in the yard, and the guards forgot about us. And I say to Terry, do you think we should tell them? And Terry says, no. He says, they'll figure it out. And he said, we got to be outside, and the first time in decades we saw the stars come out. He said, it's the most beautiful thing we've ever seen. And as they're talking, they start to weep, you know. And I'm thinking, like, how many things right around me that I don't see, you know? And here are these two guys, and they own what they've done. I mean, there is no question about the fact that they own what they've done. If they could take it back, you think they wouldn't? I mean, there are a lot of things I'd take back if I could. And so you learn to embrace the regret and let it push you forward in a direction that it actually heals our hearts. Sad. When we're leaving, they show me the building. They said, there's the building where they execute the guys, you know. And they've got a whole, almost like a religious ritual they go through to make sure that they sterilize the needles and stuff. And they have all this resuscitation equipment, they told me. So because of all the pressure, some of the guys go into cardiac arrest, but they want to resuscitate them so that they can be the ones to kill them.
Jeez.
And you just like, how far we've fallen from being made in the image of God, you know? How blind we are to the truth of our being. And so I told David, who is the man who goes and visits Terry, who is the connection through which I ended up there. And I said, you know, if Terry gets a date and he wants me to be there, I'll be there. Right? And he's not afraid in the sense to die because he knows Jesus. And Jesus has died and risen from the dead. So we know death has been conquered. He doesn't anticipate the pain of it, but none of us do, and we're all dying. So yeah, but again, you know, how do we forgive? How do we forgive someone like that? One of the things you can do is go watch the movie. The movie deals with this in such a profound way. And it mirrors the book, but you get to actually enter it in a different sort of way. And I think it might sing to you, I'm sorry for your loss. I really am. I'm sorry for all of our losses, but in the context here, for yours particularly. And I hope you can find some way to move, just even steps away from where you're stuck. And my prayers are for you for that, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Like there's a lot there. So I'm going to give you a second to sign a few books. So we're going to go lighter, a little lighter.
All right.
It's getting hot on this couch. And also, you can get signed books at paulyoungbook.com.
Is it? Is that what
I believe so. Paul Young Book, not books, but
paulyoungbook.com.
Yeah.
I didn't know I had a paulyoungbook.com.
That's why you have children, to keep you up to date.
That's exactly right.
So the next one comes from Jasmine in Indianapolis, Indiana.
Uh-huh.
And Jasmine says, do you anticipate Crossroads and Eve to be made into motion pictures?
Yeah, I do. There's already a screenplay for Crossroads to put on the screen than The Shack. The Shack is a very complicated story to try to put on the big screen. And I think Gil Netter and Stuart Hazeldine and the crew, John Fusco, who wrote the screenplay, I think they did a fantastic job with an impossible task. The book conversations already about Crossroads, great conversations right off the bat. And I think for the younger generation. Also, we'll see, but I would love to see that happen, and I kind of anticipate that it will.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Did you write the screenplay for Crossroads? I forget.
I did. I was part of a group of us that worked on it, and Nate Lewis and I and a couple others have worked on that. It's still rough draft, which always is, but it's a great start, and it's a great story. Crossroads is it's a good story. So.
All right. We have 10 minutes.
Okay.
So
ask me short questions, or questions that I have short answers to.
Maybe
Like
not
yes
this
or no
one.
ones would be really good.
Am I your favorite kid?
Yes and no.
Rude.
Depends on if I'm thinking about you.
Depends upon if the other ones are also in the room. That's
Exactly.
the only time we're all his favorite.
Oh yeah, is when you're alone. With me, yeah. That's
Yeah,
what it is.
but just in earshot of the others so that they can hear it. Tracy from Montgomery, Illinois says, where does your thoughtful insight come from?
Let me kind of describe writing for me. Writing for me is like you collect all these bones of ideas, right, until you have a big stack, and then you pile them into a boat, or you just jump into the river with them, and river just takes you downstream. The river metaphor works for me for a lot of reasons, because you have all these tributaries that run into that river, and some of them are movies you've seen or songs you've heard. I mean, I've been impacted by lyrics that have been written by musicians in as deep a way, or deeper than most sermons that I've ever heard, let me tell you. And or being out in creation, or being caught in a rainstorm, or looking at a rainbow, or looking into a baby's face. I mean, where do you get inspiration from? I mean, and couple that with a real curiosity. I've always been very curious, and I've always loved a good question. The line in Eve, one good question is worth 1,000 answers. When you allow yourself to ask the questions that are in your heart, and especially if you do it within a community of people, and when you have an opportunity, you ask. I think a lot of insight begins to just percolate out of that. I think the healthier that I've got as a human being, the freer I am with considering another person's viewpoint, or considering someone who writes from outside my tradition. So, I've gotten huge help from books and authors, especially from outside of my religious tradition and outside of even things I would agree with philosophically. But you get it in science, and you get it in, we're surrounded by insight. I think we're surrounded by beauty and wonder, and all of those are speaking into our lives all the time. I think each one of us has a different kind of voice too, and so it's about finding out how can I say this in a way that matters to me, that I can give as a gift for those that I care about. And how do I translate really hard stuff that I find beautiful, like theologians. Some theologians spend their whole life writing about like one thing, but because they do that, I don't have to. But I can see what they're trying to say. How do I translate that for my kids or my grandkids? And that exploration, I think, just opens up all kinds of worlds. Yeah.
All right. So Danielle from Peoria,
Yep.
Arizona?
Illinois.
No, Arizona.
Peoria, Arizona. I didn't know there was a Peoria, Arizona. Okay.
Well,
Nice to
now
know.
we both know.
Now we know.
I'm sorry if I butchered that really terribly. But Danielle was wondering, did you expect to change so many lives with your books?
No.
Did you expect to change your children's lives with your books?
No. I gave the book as a gift. And this is a great question, because I think good creative work is simply the crafting of space so that people can hear for themselves. I can't change anybody or heal anybody or fix anybody. I couldn't even do that with myself. I can participate in that. And I think crafting space opens up a place, an invitation for people to hear for themselves. And I think that's where the Holy Spirit steps in and Papa God and Jesus, that relationship is what changes us. The interactions that we have with face-to-face relationships with the people around us changes us. But again, even that is embedded with the presence of God all the time. But no, I had no expectations whatsoever. I made 15 copies of The Shack and went back to work. And those 15 copies did everything I wanted it to do. It was a gift. It was a Christmas present for our kids. And then we have the 6 kids, and Kim got a copy, and the rest, the leftovers, I gave to my friends. And that was that, until my friends started giving it away. So, no, I'm thrilled to participate in that. But I don't even begin to understand it. But I'm so grateful that they've done that it has opened up that kind of space. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have 5 minutes, so I'm going to kind of lead a close into it with my own question.
Okay, good.
Okay, so
This is not rehearsed.
this is not rehearsed, but it's awesome. So, in Lies That We Believe About God,
Yep.
which you can get, we've decided from paulyoungbook.com.
Okay.
If you had to choose one lie that you think is the most sneaky or the most destructive that we believe about God, which one would you choose?
That God is not good all the time. I think that's the most profound lie. In fact, if you watch the movie in The Shack, there is a scene where there's sort of this confrontation between Papa and Mackenzie. And it's right after Mackenzie's had nightmares all night long. And Mackenzie comes out for breakfast. The scene, when you watch it, you'll know it's coming, because the scene starts with, "You like Neil Young?" This is Papa. You like Neil Young? And in the book, it's Bruce Coburn, but we couldn't get the publishing rights fast enough to go. But I like Neil Young too, and so that starts this conversation. And at one point in that conversation, God says to Mackenzie, "The real flaw in your life, Mackenzie, is that you don't believe that I'm good." And I think that is one of the most fundamental lies that we don't. And frankly, our theology hasn't helped us much. Right? There's been a lot about our theology that has given us a sense that God is not good all the time. That you can't trust someone who doesn't love you. And you can't trust someone where your performance is the basis of that relationship. Because it's not gonna work. Right? At worst, you'll become some self-righteous, arrogant, religious person. And at best, you'll just give up. Because that's never the intention. It's always been a face-to-face relationship with a God who is good all the time. So that's a really critical lie in there. And then there are all kinds of implications from that. In that scene, by the way, Mackenzie says, because God says, "The great flaw in your life is that you don't believe that I'm good. And until you believe that I'm good, you're never going to be able to trust me." And I think the huge central spiritual journey of all of us is learning how to trust. Not just God, but one another, but especially God. And you can't trust someone who's not good all the time. And Mackenzie's response is, "Why should I ever trust you? Why would I ever trust you? My daughter is dead, and there's nothing you can say that will bring her back." And that's the human loss right there, right? And that's what that movie explores. That's what this book explores. That's what this conversation explores. And this is an exploding conversation. Part of the beauty of the culture and the world and the times we live in is that the walls have come down, and it's scaring everybody like crazy. We want to rebuild them ideologically. And let me tell you, a lot of it is not Jesus. When we create imaginations of those people, when we continue to make the us and them the center of how we understand humanity, all we're going to do is create more destruction. And that's been, if you know anything about history, that's the legacy we've inherited, and it's time to do something different. It was never the way of Jesus. And I don't care if you've got any religious bone in your body or not. Because like I say, God's not religious. And Jesus was never a Christian, so he's a Jew. And so, and I don't care what you bring to the table, look at the way of Jesus. And it should be a challenge to us, like, there is a different way here. And I think that once you begin looking at that as an alternative way of living that is so much in concert with the deepest longings of our hearts, that you will run into a relationship. Truth has a name. This is a quote from the movie and in the book. Truth has a name. And he's over there in the workshop covered in wood chips, so sawdust. Yeah.
All right. So we have reached the end of our hour.
Okay. So thank you, everyone,
Thanks
for being
for
a part of
joining
this.
us.
And we'll get these book plates all signed up and the books and out to you. But really appreciate our time. Thank you for your participation and being a part of this. Blessings on you, and we'll see you again down the road. What do they say? I'll leave the light on.
Thank you so much.